Amber and I are trying to do some crazy thing today with reading a story in the car. And I'm not sure if you can tell, but we're reading Just Plain Fancy. Looks like a story of Amish kids. We have some down by our house. And I know that Kenna and Cole and Owen have some up by their house. So we'll see. Just Plain Fancy. See the buggy going along the field. While their father unharnessed and watered the horse, Naomi and Ruth skipped towards the hen house. The chickens were Naomi's responsibility. She saw to their feeding and watering as well as collecting of their eggs. Everything around here is so plain, Naomi complained. Our clothes are plain, our houses are plain, even our chickens are plain. It would pleasure me just once to have something fancy. Pshaw, Naomi, you again to say such things, little Ruth scolded. Some of the words in this book are different. Grandpa says they speak Dutch. As Naomi and Ruth searched the field for eggs laid outside the hen house, they spotted a very unusual one nestled in the tall grass, down the drive and behind the hen house next to the road. The egg looked different from any I have ever seen, Naomi said quietly. It's still warm. Let's put it in Henny's nest. This one needs to be hatched. She gently picked up the egg and eased it into her basket. Although it was a bit bigger than Henny's other eggs and a little darker in color, Naomi gently tucked the egg into the nest while Henny and Ruth looked on. You're so good with chickens, Ruth chirped. I just know you're going to get your white cap this year. Mama says you're ready. Naomi was proud of her chickens and the way she raised them. The elder was coming from a working bee, or frolic, in the coming summer, and Naomi wondered whether her parents might present her with the white cap on that day. Her thoughts were interrupted by Ruth's voice. Ain't we pleasured, she said. You wanted something fancy, and now you've got it. Look at the egg. Oh, it's much bigger and different color. After the day passed, Naomi and Ruth checked Henny's nest constantly. Every day they peered over the edge of the crib, watching for signs of cracks in the shell. Then one day the eggs hatched. Look at the little chick from the fancy egg, Naomi, Ruth squealed. That egg was fancy inside and out, wasn't it? Said Naomi. Fancy. That's just what we'll name that chicken. Fancy, 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 Ruth sang out as she jumped about. Naomi smiled and clapped her hands. All that afternoon the girls saw Henny watching and studying her special little chick. Those are great big chickens. Weeks passed. Henny's chick grew quickly and were soon scratching around in the dirt. They had all lost their yellow down feathers and had grown bright white ones. All of them except Fancy. Fancy looked very different from the others. There was no doubt about it. This chick wasn't playing. Can you pick out the one that's different? One afternoon in the wash house, Naomi and Ruth overheard Aunt Sari talking to Cousin Hannah about a person in the neighboring Amish community. She dressed too fancy, Sari said. She had to be shunned. It is wrong to be fancy, Naomi asked. Indeed, yes, snapped Hannah. We are plain folk, and it is our laws, the ordun, that we might be plain. What does shun mean? Ruth asked haltingly. Someone who is shunned is shamed in front of the elders. After that, friends and neighbors are instructed not to speak to that person. They are no longer one of us, Sari answered with authority. Ruth and Naomi looked at each other and hurried outside to hang up the washing. Naomi felt botherment inside. As soon as they were finished, the girls ran to the hen house. What are we going to do? Ruth asked. Fancy is too fancy to be Amish. Then Fancy ruffled up his feathers and did something that took their breath clean away. Look, there's Fancy over here. What do you suppose he did? Well, we'll have to hide him until we know what to do, Naomi said finally. The elders will be here for the frolic tomorrow. He'll be shunned, Ruth whispered. Maybe we will be too. Then put Fancy into another part of the hen house and lock the door. There they go, marching to the other hen house. And look, she's got him in her arms. The next morning, the neighboring Amish folk arrived for the frolic. The men and boys helped add a stable onto the Vechtel's barn. They worked hard in the sun while the woman folk cooked and gossiped. Naomi and Ruth helped serve the food, poured lemonade, and threaded needles for the women who were quilting. This should have been a happy day for them, but the girls were not pleased because they were sad with worry about Fancy. They're raising the barn, and all the women are cooking and sewing. When she had served the last ladle of lemonade, Naomi started towards the hen house. Just then she noticed the open door, but before she could get there to shut it, Fancy darted out and ran towards the gathering, flapping his wings. Oh no, Naomi called out. This is all my fault. I wanted something fancy. I should have known better than to make this kind of wish. Tears ran down Ruth's cheeks when she saw what had happened. Poor Fancy, she cried. Now he'll be shunned. She couldn't catch him. Over, under, around, and through, Naomi ran after Fancy, trying to catch him before anyone noticed. And that's about the time that Fancy decided to head straight for the elders. He flew at Martha, the oldest member of the gathering. Adjusting her glasses, she gasped as he flew over her head just before landing on the clothesline where the quilts were airing. Please don't shun him, Naomi cried. I did this. I made him fancy, she sobbed. At that moment, pleased with all the attention, Fancy ruffled his feathers. and did for the guests what he had done for the girls in the hen house the day before. Those who were speechless were stunned. I dropped the book. Maybe wasn't doing a good job. He's flying to the top. There he sits on the clothesline. Grandpa, is it hard to drive and hold the camera too? Oh, look at him. Look how beautiful his feathers are. Have you figured out what he is for a bird? Mimi knows and Grandpa knows.
He's fancy.
He's fancy. Dry your tears, child. It was Martha who finally spoke. This isn't your doing. This is God's handiwork. Only He can think of colors like that. You mean you aren't going to shun Him? Ruth asked. One can only be shunned for going against the ways of our people, Martha continued. This is not a plain old chicken. This be one of God's most beautiful creatures. He is fancy, child, and that's the way of it. Look at him. Oh, look how pretty he is. Have you figured out what fancy is? Let's see. We've only got a couple more pages. Let's see if she knows. All who were gathered there rejoiced in Fancy's beauty. I believe you have this coming, child, old Martha said as she held out the new white organdy cap. Your family believes you have earned this well, and I agree. Not only have you given good and faithful care to your flock of chickens, but you have also raised one of the finest peacocks I have ever seen. Standing proudly amidst the gathering, Naomi held Fancy in her arms. We have learned many things this day. Look at his tail. Look how long his tail is. He's beautiful. And that's right, he is a peacock. And although no one ever quite knew how Fancy came to be hatched by Henny, it was never questioned. Plainly, it was a miracle, and sometimes miracles are just plain fancy. That was a lovely story.